So let's write a program that will compute the average of a list of non-negative exam scores entered by the user. So we're going to allow the user to enter as many exam scores as they want, and when they're finished, we're going to have them enter a negative number to symbolize that that's the end of the list. So let's talk about what variables I need to declare to accomplish this. In order to compute an average, we need to keep track of the total sum of all the exam scores. So assuming that the users enter these exam scores as double values, I would need to declare a double sum. I also need to know how many exam scores were entered because in order to compute an average, I need to divide the sum by the number of exam scores. So I'm going to create an int called numStudents here. Finally, I need a way to get these exam scores from the user. So I need to create my scanner object, and then I'll create a double called next that will hold in the user's next exam input. Now that I've declared my variables, I'm going to go ahead and prompt the user. So here I'm telling users to enter all of the scores to be averaged and then enter a negative number after they've entered all the scores. The next thing I want to do is initialize these variables. So our variable sum should initially be set to 0. The same thing for numStudents. And our next variable, which we said was going to be the input from the user, so next equals keyboard.next double, because we're letting them enter doubles. So let's say that the user entered the number 95. What we would want to do to compute the average is we would want to add 95, which would be stored in next, to our total sum here. And then we would also want to increment the number of students. So again, we would want to say sum equals sum plus next, whatever the value is, so 0 plus 95. And then we would also want to increment numStudents. So next we'd want them to enter another number. So we would say something like next equals keyboard.next double. Let's say that now the user entered 85 into this next variable. Well, what we would want to do is we want to repeat these steps, right? We would want to add 85 to the total sum, increment the number of students, and then get the next value. You can see here that I'm tempted to just copy and paste this to get the next number, right? And anytime you're tempted to copy and paste code, you should think, maybe I can use a loop to do this instead. So this is our code that we want to be repeated. So I'm going to go ahead and put this inside of a while loop. So while, I'm going to have some Boolean condition, I want to repeat this body of code. Now we've said that when we write a loop, we need to have initialized variables outside of the loop, and you can see that we've done that here. We need to follow the syntax for our loop that we're using. So here I've got the keyword while, and we need to follow it by a Boolean expression. And whatever we put in this Boolean expression needs to somehow be able to turn false. That way, we can get outside of the while loop at some point. Well, the only thing updating inside this body is the value of next. And we want to continuously get the next item from the user until they enter a negative number. So while what they've entered is not negative, so I'm going to say is greater than or equal to 0, I'm going to continue to do this. So users can enter a value of 0 all the way through 100. They could enter higher values, but that doesn't really make sense for us. Then I'm going to continuously loop to add what they've entered to the sum, increment the total number of students, and get the next input. So we've got our loop structure set up, but with averages, we need to do something after we loop, right? Down here, after I exit the loop, I'll have my variables sum and numStudents with the correct values in them. So this is where I would actually need to compute the average. So I'm going to say system.out.println sum divided by numStudents. And again, this computes an average like you're used to. It would divide the sum of all the exam grades by the number of exams or the number of students. So if I run this, it's going to prompt the user, and now I can enter whatever numbers I want. So I can separate them by a space or by pressing my return key. And so let's say I have 90, 95, and 100. Those are my only exam grades. Now we know that the average should be 95, right? And we've said that when we're done with the list, we need to enter a negative number. So if I say -1, then this condition should now be false because -1 is not greater than or equal to 0, and it should print out the average, which for these three numbers should be 95. So in this case, I only entered 3 numbers here, but the user could have 200 or 300 students, and as long as they don't enter a negative number, then this loop will continuously ask for the next item and keep track of the sum and the number of students. So what if we now wanted our program to accommodate for a teacher who has more than one class? Maybe these were the 3 students in their first class and they got an average of 95, but now I want to prompt them to ask, do you have another average that you want to compute? And they should tell me yes or no. If they say no, then my program should terminate. But if they say yes, then we should restart all of this again and allow them to compute another average for, let's say, another class. So after printing out the average, we want to ask the user, do you want to compute another average? And then I need to await their response. They should enter a string, either equal to yes or no. So I will create a string variable called answer, and I will set answer equal to keyboard.next line. Now, what we want to do is, if they say yes, we want to repeat everything again. What do we want to repeat? Well, we don't need to declare variables again, but we would want to prompt them again. We would need to reinitialize our variables because sum is now something other than 0, right, in order for us to calculate this average. So if we're starting over, we need to reinitialize sum to 0, reinitialize the count of the number of students, and then start our process of getting their input, and then continuously adding up the sum and incrementing the number of students, getting the next input until they enter a negative number. Then we should print the average, and then we should ask them yet again if they want to compute another average. This isn't limited to just computing 2 averages. So again, anytime I want to take all of this and copy and paste it, then this should be put inside a loop. So I'm going to indent all of this because we need to enclose it in another loop. And yes, this does mean that this while loop will be nested inside another loop. And just like you can nest branching statements, you can also nest looping statements. So let's determine what kind of loop we need. So far we know about while and do while loops. So let's determine if a while or a do while loop would work best here. So we know from our last video that the main difference between a while and a do while is that a do while loop forces the program to go through execution at least one time. Well, since we're prompting at the end, it does make sense that we force our users to do an average one time and then ask them, do you want to compute another average? So I'm going to nest all of this inside a do while loop. So here I'm going to have the keyword do, open my curly brace, and after everything that I want enclosed in the loop, I will close my do while loop and put the while statement here. Now again, remember with do while loops, I do need a semicolon at the end. And now we need to talk about what this Boolean expression is going to be. After we print out the first average, we only want to loop through this again while the user answers yes. So I can say while answer.equals yes. Note that it's still giving me an error here, and it's not because we have set up this loop wrong, but if we look at the error, it says answer cannot be resolved. What that means is that Java doesn't know what answer is. Well, usually this means we didn't declare a variable, but if we look back through our code, we say, oh, we have declared answer, it's a string, and then we got user input and stored it in answer. So this doesn't make sense. Well, we're going to cover this in more detail in a moment, but basically what's happening is that answer is a local variable, meaning that we declared answer inside of these curly braces. And since it's declared inside of these curly braces, when I'm outside of these curly braces, like in this while statement, I cannot see what answer is. So again, we'll get back to this later, but in order to fix this, we need answer declared outside of this loop. So I'm going to move it up here to where everything else is declared. So now we've got string answer declared up here, and you can see that our error message goes away. So again, to reiterate, I'm going to prompt the user, initialize all my variables, and continually add up my sum, increment the number of students, and read in the next input until the user gives me a negative input. Then I'm going to compute my average, and then ask them if they want to compute another average. If they answer yes, then we're going to go back up to the beginning of this loop and repeat it all over again. So let's run this, and let's say that the grades are a 70, an 80, and a 90. Then I'm going to say -1. It says your average is an 80. Do you want to compute another average? And it's actually not letting me say yes. You can actually see over here that the program is no longer running. What happened? I set everything up right, but remember the trick with going back and forth between reading in things like next or next double and then reading in next line. When I said answer equals keyboard.next line, the most recent thing that had been read in from the keyboard was -1. So what this did is it got the rest of this line, which we can't see here, and stored it in this string answer. Remember this thing from the scanner class video earlier and how this can happen. So in order to fix that, I'm going to say keyboard.nextLine. That's going to read the rest of this junk line here. And then when it asks me to compute another average, I will now have the ability to enter another line of yes or no. So again, if I run this, say 70, 80, 90, -2, it gives me my average. Do you want to compute another average? You can see the program's still running. If I say yes, it prompts me again, and I can say 55, 65, 75, -5, gives me my average of 65. Do you want to compute another average? If I enter anything other than yes, like maybe or the word no, then we end execution. Now note that a couple other things I could change here is I could change this answer.equals yes to answer.equals ignore case. That would allow users to enter yes with a capital Y, so perhaps that's a good idea. Also, another thing that I should probably consider is that this print line statement, where I divide sum by the number of students, could cause my program to crash. Because if for some reason num students was still equal to 0, then we'd be dividing by 0 and the program would crash. So really we should put that in an if statement. Say something like, if the num students is not 0, then we can compute the average. So now that we've seen that the body of a loop can contain other loops, remember this is called nested loops, let's look at another example. Here we have a matrices, and we want to know how can we use nested loops to get this output. So let's take a moment to look at this matrix and see what we know about it. Well, if we consider each one of these pairs of numbers as an individual cell, then we can see that we have 5 columns and 5 rows. Across each one of these rows, we can see that this first number stays the same. So I've got 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s. So we really have two different variables here. We've got the variable that's going to keep track of which row we're on, so this would be row 1, and then the variable that's going to keep track of which column that we're on. And we can see here that before we ever increment this variable for the row, we increment the column from 1 to 5, and then we want to increment the row to 2, start the column back over at 1, increment from 1 to 5, and etc. So you can kind of see this pattern. Let's look and see if we can figure out how to actually write this. So here I'm keeping my matrix over in the corner so we can refer to it. And we said that in this matrix we have two different variables. We've got one representing the number that's associated with each row. So I'm going to create an int variable called row. And if I go ahead and initialize it, we can see that it starts at 1. So I'll initialize it to 1. Then I also have this variable that represents the column. That's what's on the right-hand side of this slash. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to create an int call, short for column, and also initialize it to 1 here. Now if we just focus on this first row, if I told you to print out this first row, not using literal values, but using these variables that we just declared, then we could easily do something like that. Let's not even think about loops right now. Let's just think about what print line statements we would use. So in order to print out this first pair here, I have row equal to 1, column equal to 1, so I can just have a print statement that says print out row, a slash, call, and then a space, right? So it would look something like this. Note that I used print instead of printline because the next item that I will want to print, I want it to be on the same line. So I didn't use printline here. So again, it would print the row, a slash, the column value, and then a space. Now, if we run this, we can see that it actually did print 1/1, and there is a space here also. And so what I want to do now is print this next value. So I want to print the exact same thing, right? I'm going to paste the same code, except I want this value to have changed. So I'm going to increment column by 1. And you can see if we run this again, I've got 1 space 1 2. And we could continue in this fashion, right? I can increment column again and have the same print line statement, and it would print 1 1 1 2 1 3. And we know we want to do this all the way to 1 5. But we know now that anytime we try to copy and paste code, what we really should do is make a loop, right? So our pattern here is that I'm going to print out my value for row, a slash, my value for column, and a space. Then I'm going to increment column. So this is my pattern. I'm going to get rid of the rest of this, and we're going to put this in a loop. Let's make sure our variables are set up right. Column's going to start at 1, and we're going to say while column is less than or equal to 5, that's our max value here, less than or equal to 5, then we are going to repeat the body here. And I'm going to indent. So when column's 1, it's going to print out 1 1, increment column, print out 1 2, 1 3, 1 4, 1 5. So if I run this, you can see that it prints out this entire first row. So now we want to focus on the next line. Before we actually get into the details of the next line, we need to actually move the printer from this same current line down to the next line. So we need a system.out.println statement in order to switch to the next line. Do I want to put this inside of my loop? No, because if I put a system.out.println statement, and again, this just prints a blank line inside of my code, then if you run it, it's going to print a new line for each one. That's not what we want. So let's move it outside of this loop. So once we use this loop to print this entire line, then we're going to go down to the next line. And we won't be able to see it when we run it, but anything that prints now will print on the next line. So now that we're on the next line, we want to do the exact same thing again, except now row should have the value of 2. So I'm tempted to copy this, right, down below here. But first, increment my value of row. That way, instead of printing 1 across this whole row, it would now print 2. Also, since column changed its values all the way throughout this line, we need to reinitialize it to 1. So I'm going to say column is 1. So now that we've started that over, I ran it, and oh, this is the whole next row. So this is great. I can continue in this fashion to get all of these rows, right? But in order to continue, I would need to copy this print statement, right? So we can go down to the next line, copy this so that I can increment row, reset my column to 1, and really copy all of this over and over again. We want to do that for row is 3, row is 4, row is 5. Again, I'm tempted to copy and paste code, and we know that this means that this can all be done inside of a loop. So what I'm going to do here is look and see what out of this is repeated. Well, we know that this part is repeating over and over again. This is the first row that we print. Then we want to print a new line. Then we want to increment the value of the row, so from 1 to 2 in the next line. We want to reset column, and then, oh, this line is the same as the beginning here. So I'm going to delete all of this, and this becomes my repeated pattern. So we want to nest all of this in another while loop. So I'm going to just set up my while loop here, and let's think about what this syntax should be. So if this while loop prints out each row, right? It prints out from column being 1 to column being 5, then how many times do I want to do that? Well, we know that whatever we put in here has to have an exit condition at some point, and the only value really changing in here is row. Row's starting at 1, so we print this whole row starting at 1, and then the next time, row is going to have the value of 2. So we want to continue going through this while row is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to say while row is less than or equal to 5. We're going to do all of this. And now if I were to save and run this, we've used a nested loop to create this matrix.